What happens when one country's move forces an entire military alliance to reconsider one of its most strategically important members? At first glance, the latest tensions surrounding Iran appear to fit a familiar pattern. Tehran challenges Western interests, NATO responds with renewed vigilance, and regional uncertainty grows. But beneath those headlines lies a far more consequential story, one that may determine the future balance of power across Europe and the Middle East. The greatest pressure may not ultimately fall on Washington or Brussels. Instead, it may fall on Ankara. Positioned between Europe, the Middle East, the Black Sea, and the Caucasus, Turkey occupies a geopolitical crossroads unlike any other NATO member. Every regional crisis, every shift in military posture, and every diplomatic confrontation passes through a strategic landscape where Turkish decisions carry consequences well beyond its borders. While public attention remains fixed on Iran's actions and NATO's response, the deeper challenge concerns Turkey's increasingly delicate balancing act. As a NATO ally with complex regional relationships, significant economic interests, and its own security priorities, Ankara must navigate competing pressures that rarely point in the same direction. A decision that strengthens one strategic objective could weaken another, turning every diplomatic calculation into a difficult trade-off. But appearances can be misleading. What seems like another episode in the long-running confrontation between Iran and the West may actually expose deeper questions about alliance cohesion, regional influence, and the limits of strategic flexibility. Most observers are watching Iran. The real strategic story may be unfolding inside Turkey. To understand why Ankara now finds itself at the center of this geopolitical dilemma, we first need to examine the immediate developments that brought the region to this increasingly fragile moment. The immediate catalyst for renewed international attention has been a series of developments involving Iran that have intensified debates about regional security and strategic deterrence. While specific events continue to evolve, the broader pattern is clear. Every increase in tension forces governments across the region to reassess military readiness, diplomatic priorities, and the risks of unintended escalation. Verified developments can describe official statements, military deployments, or diplomatic initiatives. What those developments ultimately mean, however, remains a matter of strategic analysis rather than established fact. For NATO, the concern extends beyond any single incident. The alliance is focused on preserving regional stability, maintaining credible deterrence, and demonstrating that its collective security commitments remain reliable during periods of uncertainty. Any crisis affecting the Middle East, the Black Sea, or the Eastern Mediterranean inevitably influences NATO's broader security architecture because these regions are increasingly interconnected. No country illustrates that complexity more clearly than Turkey. As a long-standing NATO member, Ankara contributes to the alliance's southern defenses while simultaneously pursuing an independent regional foreign policy. It maintains important economic ties with Iran, cooperates and competes with Russia across multiple theaters, and continues balancing security interests in Syria. At the same time, Turkey plays a critical role in Black Sea security, where developments involving NATO, Russia, and neighboring states directly affect its national interests. These overlapping relationships mean Turkish policymakers rarely face simple choices. A policy designed to strengthen alliance solidarity could complicate regional diplomacy. Expanding economic cooperation might create security concerns. Preserving strategic autonomy could invite questions from allies, while closer coordination with partners may reduce Ankara's diplomatic flexibility elsewhere. Every decision carries opportunity costs because each relationship influences another. This is why the current situation cannot be understood as a straightforward contest between Iran and the West. Turkey's position is defined by strategic ambiguity, born not from indecision, but from competing national interests that require constant recalibration in an increasingly volatile environment. But those immediate developments only reveal the surface of a much older geopolitical story. The roots of today's dilemma stretch back decades, shaped by wars, alliances, and strategic choices that continue to influence every decision made today. To understand why Turkey now occupies such an uncomfortable strategic position, it is necessary to look beyond today's headlines and examine the historical forces that shaped the region. The current dilemma did not emerge overnight. Instead, it reflects decades of shifting alliances, regional conflicts, and changing power balances that gradually transformed Turkey from a frontline NATO ally into a country pursuing a more independent foreign policy. Turkey joined NATO during the early years of the Cold War, when its primary strategic value was geographic. Positioned between Europe and the Soviet Union, it served as the alliance's southeastern anchor, controlling access to the Black Sea through the Turkish Straits and providing a critical buffer against Soviet influence. During this period, alliance expectations and Turkish national interests were largely aligned because both prioritized containing Soviet expansion. The regional landscape changed dramatically after Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. A country that had previously been closely aligned with the West adopted an independent foreign policy that challenged many aspects of the existing regional order. Relations between Iran and Western governments deteriorated, while new security concerns emerged across the Middle East. Yet despite competing interests, Turkey and Iran continued to maintain economic links and diplomatic engagement, recognizing that geography required cooperation even when broader strategic objectives differed. Following the Cold War, NATO's attention gradually expanded beyond territorial defense to include wider regional security challenges. At the same time, Turkey's own ambitions evolved. Rather than viewing itself solely as NATO's southeastern flank, Ankara increasingly sought influence across the Middle East, the Black Sea, the Balkans, and the South Caucasus. This growing strategic autonomy occasionally complemented alliance priorities, but it also created areas where Turkish objectives diverged from those of its partners. The Syrian civil war further complicated these dynamics. Turkey, Iran, Russia, and Western countries all became involved, often pursuing different objectives while occasionally cooperating on limited issues. The conflict highlighted a defining feature of modern geopolitics. States can compete and cooperate simultaneously. Ankara and Tehran found themselves supporting different regional priorities, yet they continued engaging diplomatically because complete confrontation served neither country's long-term interests. Russia's renewed regional influence added another layer of complexity. Its growing role in Syria, its presence in the Black Sea, and its relationships throughout the South Caucasus forced Turkey to balance deterrence with dialogue. Energy corridors crossing Turkish territory also became increasingly important, strengthening Ankara's position as a bridge between producers and European markets, while reinforcing its desire for strategic flexibility. Today, the Black Sea and the South Caucasus have become central arenas where military security, energy infrastructure, and great power competition intersect. For Turkey, every decision now carries implications across multiple regions simultaneously. Alliance commitments remain essential, but national interests increasingly require independent calculations that do not always fit neatly within broader expectations. The history explains why today's choices are far more complicated than many assume. With this historical foundation established, the deeper strategic calculations behind each actor's behavior become much clearer. With the historical context established, the current situation begins to look very different. The headlines often frame the story as a confrontation between Iran and NATO, but that interpretation only captures part of the picture. The deeper reality is that every major actor is pursuing a distinct strategic objective, and those objectives overlap, compete, and occasionally reinforce one another. Understanding these calculations reveals why the crisis extends far beyond any single diplomatic exchange or military development. For Iran, the central objective is not simply confrontation, it is deterrence. Facing decades of sanctions, political pressure, and security challenges, Tehran has consistently sought to build strategic depth by expanding its regional relationships and demonstrating that attempts to isolate it carry costs. From an Iranian perspective, resilience itself becomes a form of strategic messaging. Every action is intended not only to address immediate security concerns, but also to signal that Iran retains the ability to influence regional dynamics despite external pressure. At the same time, Iranian leaders must weigh the benefits of projecting strength against the risks of provoking a broader confrontation that could undermine long-term national interests. Turkey approaches the same developments through an entirely different strategic lens. Ankara's first priority remains protecting its own national security while preserving room for independent decision-making. As a NATO member, Turkey benefits from collective defense and contributes significantly to the alliance's Southern and Black Sea security responsibilities. Yet it also shares borders and economic relationships with countries whose interests do not always align with those of NATO. This creates a constant balancing act. Turkish policymakers must protect trade routes, energy supplies, and regional stability while avoiding unnecessary escalation on multiple fronts. Domestic political considerations further complicate these decisions, making foreign policy inseparable from internal security and economic priorities. This explains why Turkey's diplomacy often appears contradictory. Public statements may emphasize alliance solidarity, while parallel diplomatic channels remain open with regional rivals. What some observers interpret as inconsistency is more accurately understood as strategic flexibility. Ankara seeks to preserve as many options as possible in an environment where circumstances can change rapidly and where rigid alignment could reduce its ability to respond effectively. For NATO, the calculation centers on credibility. The alliance's strength depends not only on military capabilities, but also on the confidence that members will uphold collective commitments during periods of uncertainty. Developments affecting the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Black Sea therefore become interconnected challenges. A perceived weakening of deterrence in one region could influence strategic calculations elsewhere. Consequently, NATO's response to regional tensions is designed not merely to address immediate events, but also to reinforce alliance cohesion and reassure member states that collective security remains dependable. Russia views the regional landscape through another strategic framework. Moscow has developed working relationships with both Iran and Turkey while maintaining competition with NATO across several theaters. Rather than seeking identical objectives with either country, Russia benefits when divisions within the alliance complicate Western strategic planning. At the same time, Moscow has incentives to preserve functional relations with Ankara, particularly regarding the Black Sea, regional diplomacy, and economic cooperation. This produces a relationship characterized by both competition and pragmatic engagement, demonstrating that geopolitical rivals often cooperate where mutual interests exist. The United States faces a similarly complex challenge. Washington seeks to maintain credible regional deterrence, support alliance cohesion, and reduce the likelihood of wider escalation. Yet American strategic attention is distributed across multiple regions simultaneously. Decisions affecting the Middle East cannot be separated entirely from commitments in Europe or developments elsewhere. As a result, U.S. policymakers must balance regional priorities without allowing one crisis to undermine broader strategic objectives. These competing calculations reveal several important contrasts. Public diplomacy often emphasizes principles and official positions, while strategic signaling communicates intentions through military posture, economic policy, and diplomatic engagement. Tactical flexibility may provide short-term advantages, but long-term commitments shape credibility over decades. Economic cooperation can continue even between states that compete in security affairs, illustrating that commercial relationships and strategic rivalries frequently coexist. Likewise, alliance membership does not eliminate national interests. Instead, governments continually weigh collective obligations against independent strategic priorities. Energy security reinforces these complexities. Turkey occupies a vital position connecting energy producers with European markets, making stable transportation routes a strategic concern for multiple governments. Intelligence assessments, military deployments, and diplomatic negotiations all reflect an understanding that disruptions affecting one sector can quickly influence others. Security, economics, and regional politics have become deeply interconnected. This is why describing Turkey's position as a choice between Iran and NATO oversimplifies the challenge. Ankara is not merely selecting one partner over another. Its broader objective is to avoid a scenario in which any decision significantly weakens its overall strategic position. Preserving regional influence, maintaining alliance credibility, protecting economic interests, and safeguarding national security must all be pursued simultaneously, even when those goals create competing pressures. This is where the story changes, from a regional dispute into a contest over the future balance of power. If these strategic calculations continue to evolve, the consequences may extend far beyond Turkey or Iran alone. The strategic significance of this situation extends well beyond the immediate tension between Iran, Turkey, and NATO. Even if the current crisis gradually eases through diplomacy or de-escalation, the broader consequences are likely to influence regional security calculations for years to come. That is because the episode highlights deeper structural changes in the international system rather than a temporary political disagreement. At the regional level, Syria remains one of the most sensitive arenas. Multiple external powers continue to pursue different security objectives there, making any shift in Turkish, Iranian, or Russian policy potentially significant. A change in one country's posture can alter military coordination, border security, humanitarian conditions, and diplomatic negotiations. Similar dynamics are visible in Iraq, where competing political and security interests require constant balancing between domestic priorities and regional relationships. The Eastern Mediterranean presents another layer of complexity. Maritime security, energy exploration, and overlapping strategic interests have already made the region highly competitive. If broader tensions increase, governments may devote greater attention to protecting critical infrastructure and maintaining freedom of navigation. Likewise, developments in the South Caucasus and the Black Sea cannot be viewed in isolation. These regions increasingly connect European security, regional trade, and energy transportation, meaning instability in one area can influence calculations across another. For NATO, the challenge extends beyond responding to individual developments. Alliance cohesion depends on maintaining confidence among members while adapting to a rapidly changing strategic environment. Different national priorities inevitably produce different policy preferences, making consultation and coordination increasingly important. Successfully managing these differences strengthens collective credibility, while unresolved disagreements may encourage competitors to test the alliance's political unity. The United States must also consider how regional developments fit within its wider global strategy. Resources, diplomatic attention, and military planning are finite. Decisions made in one theater can influence priorities elsewhere, requiring policymakers to balance immediate crises against longer-term strategic objectives. Maintaining deterrence while avoiding unnecessary escalation remains a persistent challenge. Meanwhile, Russia may identify opportunities whenever divisions emerge among Western partners, even as it continues managing its own complex relationships throughout the region. China, although less directly involved in regional security, has significant economic interests linked to trade routes, infrastructure, and stable energy markets. Prolonged uncertainty could affect investment decisions and broader economic planning, demonstrating that geopolitical competition increasingly extends beyond military affairs. Energy markets also respond to uncertainty as much as to actual disruptions. Expectations about future risks can influence investment, transportation planning, and commercial confidence before any physical supply changes occur. Likewise, defense planners must prepare not only for current conditions, but also for a range of possible future scenarios, making uncertainty itself a strategic variable rather than simply an obstacle to prediction. Ultimately, the outcome will produce different advantages and disadvantages depending on how regional actors adapt. Some may gain diplomatic influence through effective mediation, while others could face greater strategic pressure if existing partnerships weaken. Short-term stability may reduce immediate tensions, but it does not necessarily resolve the underlying competition shaping regional politics. The immediate crisis may eventually fade, but its strategic consequences could shape regional politics for years. The remaining question is not what has happened, but what happens next. Looking ahead, the future of this geopolitical dilemma will not be determined by a single headline, military deployment, or diplomatic statement. Instead, it will depend on how multiple governments interpret one another's intentions and adjust their strategies over time. While no outcome can be predicted with certainty, several realistic scenarios illustrate the range of possibilities now facing the region. The first scenario is one of continued strategic balancing by Turkey. In this outcome, Ankara maintains its long-standing approach of preserving relationships with competing powers while avoiding commitments that unnecessarily limit its flexibility. Turkey would continue supporting its NATO obligations, sustain dialogue with regional neighbors, and pursue economic cooperation where possible. The advantage of this strategy is that it preserves diplomatic room for maneuver. The risk, however, is that maintaining strategic ambiguity becomes increasingly difficult if tensions continue to intensify and external pressure grows. A second possibility involves stronger expectations from NATO for greater policy alignment among member states. Should regional security concerns increase, alliance priorities may become more demanding, leaving less space for independent diplomatic initiatives. For Turkey, this could strengthen military cooperation within NATO, while simultaneously complicating relations with neighboring countries. Such a development might reinforce alliance cohesion, but it could also reduce Ankara's ability to balance competing regional interests as effectively as it has in the past. The third scenario centers on a more assertive regional posture from Iran. If Tehran concludes that a firmer approach better serves its security objectives, neighboring governments could respond by strengthening deterrence, expanding diplomatic coordination, or increasing defense preparedness. Such developments would not necessarily make direct confrontation inevitable, but they could create a more competitive regional environment in which misunderstandings become increasingly costly. The strategic incentive for all sides would remain avoiding escalation while protecting their respective interests. A fourth and more optimistic scenario involves gradual diplomatic stabilization. Through continued communication, confidence-building measures, and practical cooperation on shared concerns, regional actors could reduce immediate tensions without eliminating their underlying differences. Competition would remain, but it would unfold within a framework that prioritizes crisis management over confrontation. This outcome would benefit regional stability, economic planning, and broader international security, although achieving it would require sustained political commitment from multiple governments. Each scenario carries distinct opportunities and risks. None depends solely on the actions of Turkey, Iran, NATO, or any single external power. Instead, future developments will emerge from continuous interaction among military planning, diplomatic engagement, economic interests, and domestic political considerations. That interconnected reality makes forecasting difficult, but also demonstrates why flexibility remains one of the most valuable strategic assets. The next chapter may depend less on military strength than on diplomatic calculation. Ultimately, the broader lesson extends beyond today's headlines. As we return to the question that opened this documentary, the answer becomes far more complex than it first appeared. The central issue was never simply whether Iran challenged NATO or whether the alliance would respond. The deeper story has always been about how one regional development exposed the increasingly difficult strategic position occupied by Turkey, a country whose geography, alliances, and national interests intersect at one of the world's most important geopolitical crossroads. Throughout this analysis, a consistent pattern has emerged. Modern geopolitics rarely offers clear choices between right and wrong or friend and rival. Instead, governments must balance overlapping security concerns, economic interests, diplomatic relationships, and domestic priorities, often at the same time. Turkey's position illustrates this reality better than almost any other regional power. Strengthening one relationship can complicate another, while preserving strategic flexibility often requires careful diplomacy rather than dramatic decisions. The implications extend well beyond Ankara. The way this challenge evolves will influence NATO's internal cohesion, regional deterrence, energy security, and the broader balance of power across Europe and the Middle East. It will also shape how other middle powers approach an international system increasingly defined by competition among major states rather than clear ideological blocs. Strategic autonomy and alliance commitments are no longer mutually exclusive concepts, but balancing them successfully has become considerably more difficult. That is why the significance of this story reaches beyond today's developments. It reflects a broader transformation in international politics, where geography, economics, diplomacy, and military strategy are becoming more interconnected than ever before. As global power competition continues to intensify, Turkey's ability to navigate between competing centers of influence may become one of the defining geopolitical tests of the coming decade. The real question is no longer whether tensions will continue, but whether the existing regional balance can adapt before a larger crisis emerges.